Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
It is late afternoon on a parade ground near Calcutta. The air is thick and still. March heat. A soldier is walking in circles. His name is Mangal Pandey. He is 29 years old, a sepoy, an Indian soldier in the army of the British East India Company. And he has a loaded musket in his hands. He has been walking like this for a while now, agitated, muttering. His comrades can see him from the guardhouse, and not one of them moves. A British sergeant major arrives on the scene. Pandey threatens him with his sword. Then a British lieutenant rides up on horseback. Pandey raises the musket and fires. He misses the man, hits the horse. More officers arrive. A general gallops in, and still the regiment watches. Some of them will later say they could not bring themselves to arrest a man they considered a brother. One soldier, just one, tries to hold Pandey back. His name is Sheikh Paltu. His comrades immediately throw stones and shoes at him for the attempt. Pandey, realizing he stands alone, puts the musket to his own chest and pulls the trigger with his toe. He survives, barely. He is arrested, tried, hanged, and then India burns. This is the Daily History Chronicle, where we explore the moments that shaped our world and discover why they still matter today. I'm Richard Backus, and every day I get to share a piece of history that I think you'll find as fascinating as I do. Today is March 29th, and 168 years ago today, on a parade ground near Barrackpore, India, a single soldier fired a shot that did not kill anyone and set in motion the end of the largest corporation in the history of the world. That corporation ruled over 200 million people. It had its own army, its own courts, its own prisons, and it had been doing this for 2.5 centuries. Here's what fascinates me about this moment. The thing that lit the fuse, the specific grievance that drove Mangal Pandey to that parade ground may not have even been real. The spark that ended the East India Company might have been a rumor. Understanding what happened on March 29, 1857, requires holding several truths at the same time. Mangal Pandey was a man acting out of genuine religious conviction. He was probably impaired. He failed to inspire anyone to follow him, and yet, somehow he succeeded in ways he couldn't have imagined. All of that is true. Let me build the clock for you. Because the parade ground at Barrackpore on March 29th doesn't make sense without understanding what had been happening in India for the previous 100 years. The British East India Company, and I want you to really sit with what this thing was a corporation, started as a trading company in 1600. Over the next 2.5 centuries, it gradually took control of the Indian subcontinent through a combination of military force, shrewd diplomacy, and what we would today call predatory contracts. By the mid-1800s, the company didn't just trade in India. It governed India, it collected taxes, administered justice, maintained a standing army of over 200,000 soldiers, the vast majority of them Indian sepoys. And it did all of this not for a country, not for a government, but for shareholders. Think about what that means for a moment. The people deciding the fate of 200 million Indians were, at a fundamental level, accountable to investors in London. And by 1857, those Indians had been watching the company dismantle their world for decades. Traditional rulers were being deposed. Farmland was being converted from subsistence crops to export products to serve company profits. High-caste Hindu soldiers who had served proudly in the Bengal army were watching their status erode as the company recruited from lower castes. And through it all, there was a persistent, spreading fear that the British intended to destroy Indian religion entirely, to convert the subcontinent to Christianity, one soldier at a time. That fear was the context. That was the powder keg. All it needed was a spark. Here's what troubles me, and what I keep turning over. The spark was a cartridge. In early 1857, the British East India Company introduced a new rifle to its Indian forces, the Enfield P-53. To load it, soldiers had to bite off the end of a paper cartridge before ramming it into the barrel. And a rumor spread quickly, broadly, unstoppably, that the cartridges were greased with a mixture of cow fat and pig fat, beef tallow, sacred to Hindus, pork lard, forbidden to Muslims. For soldiers who took their religion seriously, and many did, biting the cartridge would mean ritual defilement, loss of caste, spiritual corruption. It would be, in the most literal sense, the British putting something unholy in their mouths. The company tried to reassure the soldiers. They said the cartridges contained no animal fat. They offered to let soldiers grease their own cartridges. None of it worked, because the damage wasn't really about the cartridges. The cartridges were just proof of what everyone already suspected. Here's what the evidence actually tells us. Historians have never conclusively confirmed that the cartridges were greased with animal fat. The British military records from that period are contradictory. The physical cartridges themselves are long gone. What we know is that the rumors spread like fire, and that the company's own clumsy response to those rumors, initially dismissive, then panicked, made everything worse. It is entirely possible that the event that ended the largest corporation in human history, that reshaped the political structure of the Indian subcontinent, that directly led to the establishment of the British Raj, was triggered by a rumor that was never verified. I'm not saying the grievances weren't real. They were. The company had spent decades giving Indian soldiers every reason to believe the worst. But the specific thing, the grease on the cartridge, may have been the story a frustrated, frightened population told itself to make sense of accumulated injustice. And that's worth sitting with. Now, who was Mangal Pandey? He was from a high-caste Brahmin family in what is now Uttar Pradesh. He joined the company's Bengal army in 1849. By the accounts of those who served with him, he was a competent soldier, deeply religious, and proud of his caste identity, all qualities that made the cartridge controversy hit him harder than it might have hit someone else. On the afternoon of March 29, 1857, several accounts suggest Pandey may have been under the influence of bhang, cannabis, before he walked onto that parade ground. The British general who galloped to the scene later described him as being in a religious frenzy. Whatever state he was in, his actions were his own. He called out to his fellow soldiers to rise. "Come out! Fight! This is the moment!" And they didn't. A few muttered support. A few drew back from restraining him. But no one followed him into open revolt. That one soldier, Sheikh Paltu, who tried to hold him back and was rewarded with stones and shoes from his comrades, is one of the most underappreciated figures in this story. He was later promoted for his loyalty. He was also murdered inside the cantonment before his regiment was formally disbanded. History found no comfortable place for a man who chose loyalty when loyalty was expensive. Pandey was court-martialed, sentenced to death, and, in what historians read as a sign of how rattled the British were, executed 10 days ahead of schedule. They had originally set his hanging for April 18th. They moved it to April 8th because they feared that waiting would invite revolt. Then they disbanded the entire 34th Bengal Native Infantry Regiment, 900 men, in disgrace for failing to restrain Pandey. That punishment rippled through every regiment in the Bengal Army. The message was, you will be held collectively responsible. The sepoys heard a different message. There is no way to be safe. 6 weeks after Pandey was hanged, the garrison at Meerut exploded. 85 members of the 3rd Bengal Light Cavalry had been imprisoned for refusing to use the Enfield cartridges. Their comrades broke them out of prison, killed their officers, and marched on Delhi. Similar uprisings followed in Kanpur, Lucknow, Jhansi, Bareilly, and Gwalior. The rebellion was eventually put down, brutally. British reprisals involved mass hangings, soldiers blown from the mouths of cannons, entire villages destroyed. The violence was savage on both sides. Neither side in this story was innocent of atrocity. But the political consequence was seismic. The British Parliament looked at what the East India Company had allowed to happen, looked at the catastrophic mismanagement that had turned 200,000 armed soldiers into an existential threat, and did something remarkable. They shut the company down. The Government of India Act of 1858 transferred control of India directly to the British Crown. The East India Company, 258 years old, the largest commercial enterprise in human history, was dissolved. A corporation that had governed a civilization was replaced by direct government rule, not because the British decided to be more ethical, because the company had become ungovernable. We're still living with the questions this story raises. What Mangal Pandey's story ultimately forces us to examine is not just the injustice of colonialism, though that's real and it's important. It's something more specific. What happens when a corporation becomes the government? When the entity making decisions about hundreds of millions of people's lives is accountable, not to those people, not even to a country, but to shareholders seeking a return. The East India Company didn't set out to run a brutal empire. It set out to trade. But the logic of protecting trade led it to build armies. The logic of protecting armies led it to acquire territory. The logic of administering territory led it to collect taxes, run courts, control populations. And at every step, the people inside that territory, their rights, their religions, their dignity, were secondary to the bottom line. Not because company officials were uniquely evil, because that's what happens when profit is the organizing principle of governance. Today, we have corporations with revenues larger than most nations' GDP, making decisions that affect billions of people, with accountability structures that would be recognizable to the East India Company's shareholders. I'm not suggesting any modern corporation is the East India Company, but 1857 is one of history's clearest case studies in what happens when corporate power grows beyond any democratic structure's capacity to check it. And eventually, the people it governs find a way to say, enough. The philosopher Edmund Burke, a member of Parliament who spent years trying to hold the East India Company accountable in the 1780s, decades before the rebellion, warned that the company represented a state in the disguise of a merchant. Power, once accumulated, finds ways to entrench itself, to make itself seem permanent and natural. The East India Company spent 250 years becoming so embedded in the governance of India that dismantling it required a civilization-wide rebellion. Mangal Pandey didn't know he was lighting that fuse. He was a man on a parade ground, furious about what he believed was being done to his faith, acting on impulse, or conviction, or religious frenzy. The accounts differ. He failed to incite the uprising he wanted. He was hanged, and then India rose anyway, and everything changed. Here's what I keep coming back to. Modern India celebrates Mangal Pandey as a national hero, a freedom fighter, the first shot fired in the first war of independence. There are parks named for him, stamps bearing his image, a major Bollywood film. That celebration is genuine, and it makes sense. He stood up when standing up was fatal, and yet he may have been under the influence of bhang. He failed to inspire a single fellow soldier to join him. The grievance that drove him, the greased cartridge, may have been based on a rumor. He was, by most historical accounts, acting alone and impulsively. Both of those things are true. He was brave and he was reckless. He was driven by real grievance and possibly by misinformation. He failed and he succeeded. All of it is true, and none of it cancels out the rest. What's also true is that the system that killed him bore the seeds of its own destruction. The East India Company had spent 2.5 centuries treating people as inputs to a profit calculation, and March 29, 1857, was the moment those people pushed back hard enough that the calculation no longer worked. One sepoy on a parade ground, one loaded musket, one missed shot, and the largest corporation in human history never survived it. I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow, we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, consider these questions. When a corporation accumulates enough power to govern people's lives, who is responsible for what it does? Its executives, its shareholders, or the governments that allowed it to grow unchecked? Was Mangal Pandey a hero, a cautionary tale, or something history doesn't have a clean word for? And if the spark that ended the East India Company was a rumor, does the injustice still matter? Because that's what March 29th, 1857 teaches us. Not just about colonial power, but about how systems fall, rarely all at once. Usually because one person on one afternoon decides they've had enough. Thank you for your time. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. If you really enjoyed it, please tell a friend. I hope you will join me again tomorrow for more of our shared history.